Hello, my name is Sydney, and today I'm going to be talking about the basic history of Korea and how Korea's history has influenced its folklore, and vice versa. Okay, first we have to start 400,000 years ago, which is when Homo erectus first entered the Korean peninsula. Prehistoric Koreans lived semi-nomadic lives, and city-states started forming in the 11th century BCE. The most powerful city-state was Chosun, and it slowly grew to control an area in the northern half of the peninsula and into what is now China. Tension had been growing between Chosun and China for centuries, when finally the Western Han Dynasty invaded and overthrew Chosun in 108 BCE. They created 4 Chinese colonies. Only one of these colonies, the Lilang Commandery, stayed, as the other 3 were called back to China after resistance from local Koreans. Aspects of Chinese culture, like its writing system and the Confucian philosophy, entered Korea from the Lilang Commandery. Confucianism turned out to be really important, and Confucianism would later influence a lot of aspects of Korean culture. So let's talk about what Confucianism is. At its basic, it's about harmony between people by respecting others based on your relationship with them, including filial piety, or respecting your parents.
I think some of the things that have stuck with me that I believe stems from Korean culture is things like respecting of my elders is like a huge one that I still carry as a value of mine. And I know that really stemmed from like Korean culture of looking, always bowing down to your elders. And even like my older sister, who's only a couple of years older than me, like giving her level of respect. Sometimes even when I didn't want to, I was just taught that.
It also placed a strong value on education. Confucianism would only grow to influence Korea more and more as different kingdoms in the future adopted it, and as different religions, specifically Buddhism, rose in popularity that had similar values. Since Confucianism has influenced Korea so much, it shouldn't be a surprise that its values show up in a lot of folklore. Now, what is folklore? Folklore is a loosely defined word that pretty much applies to all stories, customs, and beliefs that are passed down through a group of people or a culture. Since folklore is a very broad group, in this video I'll only be focusing on folk stories of Korean origin that are divorced or at least seemingly separate from stories from Korean shamanism or mythology. Now going back, a good example of folklore that captures Confucian values, specifically the importance of education, as well as filial piety, or hyodo in Korean, is about Han Seok-bong and his mother. In the tale, Han Seok-bong's mother is poor and makes chuk, Korean rice cakes, to support herself and to support her son's studies. She purchases ink and paper for him to practice calligraphy on, but since he wants to save his mother money, Seok-bong writes on leaves and stone instead. When his mother discovers this, she chastises him and says that if he wanted to show true devotion to her, he would respect her want to buy him supplies and would instead use his supplies to make himself a better person through his studies. After hearing this, Seok-bong leaves to go to a temple and dedicates himself to studying calligraphy. 3 years later, he comes back to his mother's house, partially because he missed her, and partially because he believed he had learned all he could from the temple. In response, his mother wanted him to prove that. He had mastered calligraphy, so she blew out her lamp and cut Tyok, while Seok-bong wrote calligraphy in the dark. When she turned the lamp on, her Tyok was perfectly cut, while Seok-bong's characters were crooked and misshapen. Disappointed in her son, Seok-bong's mother sent him back to the temple that night. He went on to study even harder and to become one of the most renowned calligraphers in Korea. Going back to history, it's now 400 BC. 3 kingdoms, Goguryeo, Baekje, and Shinla, ruled most of the Korean peninsula. They were in conflict with each other for hundreds of years until Shinla, around 660s AD, allied with China and won control of Goguryeo and Baekje's land. A period of peace followed, during which the Shinla state encouraged the spread of Confucianism and made Buddhism the national religion. Going back to Confucianism and folklore, another good story, again about filial piety, is about Shimchong. The story is about a girl who has a blind father and no mother, who goes door to door asking for food every day to feed herself and her father until she becomes old enough to support him through her needlework. Eventually, towards the end of the story, she sacrifices her life for him in order to pay off a large debt he acquired while trying to regain his eyesight. Despite the tragedy of her death, readers are supposed to believe that Chung did the right thing because she put her father's well-being above her own. This story also touches on another aspect of Korean culture, Jong. Jong is a complicated, multifaceted word that I'm going to broadly define as kindness and sympathy shown to others who are in the same group or community you're in. This is shown when the villagers give Jong food every day during her early life because they're a part of the same community and thus are responsible for her. Going back to Korea's history, Shinla started losing control of areas of the peninsula in the 800s. And many different clans or powerful family groups fought for power. Korea was eventually reunited by the Koryo state in 938. Fun fact, Koryo is where the English language got their name for Korea. Eventually, Koryo was weakened due to invasions in the 1200s and was eventually overthrown in 1392 by the Chosun state, which should sound familiar because it was named after one of the ancient kingdoms. This period in Korean history saw the reduction of women's status in society, along with the creation of the Korean writing system, Hangul. For Hangul, Chinese characters, remember, brought in by the Lilang commandery, were being used. The Korean language was being spoken, but it was being written down using Chinese characters. Hangul was created to be simple and straightforward compared to the complex and many Chinese characters they were. And it was created in order to improve literacy among the general population. In the 1800s, the Chosun state was weakening due to, but not limited to, rebellion, the influence of outside forces, and corruption. During this time, Korea, by choice, may I add, was politically and economically isolated, and Japan, who had had many conflicts with Korea throughout its history, was not very happy about it. Japan made Korea sign a treaty forcing them to trade with them, and after Japan won a war with China about pretty much who had control over Korea, Japan began colonizing Korea in 1910. Japan may have helped industrialize some parts of Korea, but it also left an immeasurable amount of damage. They forced countless women into being sex slaves, made men do forced work, and made Koreans take Japanese names, practice Shintoism, and require that Koreans only speak Japanese.
And my dad, because he was forced to speak Japanese.
Pretty much trying to erase Korean culture. Or, as Britannica School put it, the Japanese treated Koreans very harshly, which is putting it a little lightly. Then World War II came, and in 1945, Korea was free from Japan's control. The United States, a democratic state, came to occupy the southern half of the peninsula, while the Soviet Union, a communist one, would occupy the northern half. The North and South would be in conflict with each other until 1948, as in the September of that year, they would officially become two separate states.
It affected my dad and his family because they were actually all born in North Korea, and they took a small boat and had whole family on this small boat and tried to flee North Korea. But youngest of the child was only like 6 months old, and baby would cry, and in order for North Koreans not to hear them, otherwise they would all be killed because of her, so they actually suffocated her not to breathe or not to cry.
For the video's purpose, did the baby die?
No, she is still alive, and she's actually 70 years old. So it was very tough, and what they had to go through to escape from North Korea was very, I think it traumatized a lot of the family back then.
Then in 1950, the Korean War broke out. It ended in a stalemate 3 years later in 1953, with Korea still divided. The war left over 3 million people dead in Korea in a state of both physical and economic destruction. At the end of the 1950s, the GDP per capita was well below $100. In 2017, South Korea's GDP was over $2,600.
I haven't even been back there since '74, but people who been to Korea to visit, let's say before the 70s, they would all say it was a poor country. Now, like 80s and to now, people who's visited, they just love it. It's changed so much, improved so much.
South Korea has flourished a lot since the end of the Korean War, and there are many tangible reasons why it has. An example, in the 1960s, the government worked with companies like Samsung to improve the economy. And it worked. But the mass individual effort is really what pushed South Korea into the success story it is today. A focus on education and a sense of loyalty to your community and country. All beliefs and values reflected in Korean folklore were big factors in this push. One example of a folk story is about a girl named Nonge. Nonge has many stories attached to her name, but the story of her death is the one that most strongly showcases Chung, or loyalty to one's country. That is found in many folk stories and is what drove many Koreans to help rebuild their country. In the story, which is set in the 16th century, the Japanese had just killed over 60,000 Koreans during a battle, then the subsequent capture of a major city. Nonge, fueled by a want for vengeance, snuck into a party celebrating the Japanese victory as a female entertainer. She lured the general who had been in charge of the capture of the city onto a rock that sat high above the Nam River, which roared loudly with the water that had just pooled into it as it was the start of the monsoon season. Nonge wrapped her arms around the man and jumped into the river, killing them both. She showed true Chung. She killed herself for her country. Of course, not all themes and values that come up frequently in folklore is a reflection of all Korean people's beliefs.
There are certain things that I do not like, but there are certain things I do love that I kept, like respecting elders and so forth, family-oriented type of things that I kept the tradition. But like a culture-wise, things like how mother-in-law almost tortures daughter-in-law, treating them like they're slaves, stuff like that, I just despise. I just got rid of that culture, but I kept a good part.
They're all individual people who have their own opinions on life. But even so, it should not be discredited that common views do, or at least did, exist, and that they were shaped by Korea's ancient history, and in return, those values shaped Korea's modern history. Has Korean folklore affected your life in any way?
No.
Hi, my name's Sydney, and today I'm going to be talking about the LA riots and how Koreatown rebuilt itself afterward. People immigrated to America in three major waves. The first, through 1903 to 1905, of about 7,500 Koreans who came to Hawaii to work. On top of that, many other Korean people came to America to go to college, like the man who would eventually become a dictator in South Korea. In 1924, Congress passed a law that barred Asian people from immigrating to the U.S. Despite this, many other anti-Asian legislation, violence, and general discrimination that Korean Americans had to face, they formed communities together. For example, in the 1930s, 650 Korean Americans formed a community, what would eventually become Koreatown, in an area of south central LA. Thankfully, in 1952, Congress passed the McCarran-Walter Act, and the prohibiting of Asian immigrants ended. The second wave, starting in 1950, mostly consisted of Korean women who had married American soldiers coming to the state, and Korean children being adopted into American families. The third wave began in 1967 and was a direct result of the 1965 Immigration Act, which allowed people immigrating to reunite with their family or for work purposes to immigrate more easily. After the third wave, Korean American communities continued to grow throughout the United States.
I think with Korean culture, from what I'm aware of and what I was taught, there's definitely like the traditions, like I said, of respecting your elders. For me, at least, it was like getting good grades and making sure you have a good career, and kind of like there's like certain ideals of like what success means, and I think that stems from the culture. And probably growing up and becoming successful, therefore then you take care of your parents afterwards. For Korean American culture, which is what I relate to, I think it's confusing. I think I probably relate more to American culture, but I have this like upbringing in this base of Korean culture I grew up with, and like my earlier latter of my life. I think Korean American is kind of, it's obvious, like it's like a fusion. Now my primary language is English. I don't speak Korean very often, although like when I speak with relatives, I will, speak the Korean language as much as I can and what I understand. Also, I think the idea of success in my mind is no longer that traditional Korean culture. It's more about personal inner happiness and achieving that in life, whatever that may look like, and that's could possibly be an American thing. I'm not really sure, but
1991, Latasha Harlins, a black 15-year-old girl, was shot and killed by Sun Ja-doo, a Korean woman, in Doo's store in South Los Angeles. Latasha had been getting ready to pay for a bottle of orange juice she'd put in her backpack when Doo grabbed her sweater. Latasha had broken free from her grip by punching Doo in the face and put the orange juice bottle on the counter before moving to leave the store. Doo then pulled out a handgun and killed her. Sun Ja-doo would serve no jail time for her actions. This case captured the tension between African American and Korean American communities in LA at the time. African Americans complained of being treated with rudeness from Korean shop workers, and some thought that Korean-owned businesses in majority black areas were taking money away from their communities, while Korean Americans were concerned about gang crimes that had taken the lives of some store owners in the community, and the concerns and stresses of just immigrating to a new country. 2 weeks before Latasha's murder, on March 3, 1991, Rodney King was beat by 3 police officers. King had surrendered to the police after leading them on a car chase throughout Los Angeles. However, he still resisted arrest. The police officers kicked and hit him with their batons, well beyond what they had to do to detain him. While this was happening, someone across the street was filming King's assault. The footage was sent to the press and caused nationwide anger and debate. On April 29, 1992, the police officers involved were found not guilty, and the LA riots began.
I didn't know anybody in LA at the time, only saw through news. So yeah, it was crazy.
The riots spanned for 3 to 6 days, depending on who's reporting on it. And according to This Day in History, the LA riot killed more than 60 people, injured almost 2,000, led to 7,000 arrests, and caused nearly $1 billion in property damage, including the burning of more than 3,000 buildings. Koreatown and Korean-owned businesses were hit particularly hard because of the tension that had been building between Koreans and African Americans. According to a 1992 unofficial survey by Radio Korea, about $350 million of damage was done to around 1,000 Korean stores. Later studies would come out and claim that from 50 to 75% of destroyed or majorly damaged buildings were either Korean-owned or run. During the riots, Korean store owners walked on the roofs of their businesses holding guns, defending them from looters. After the riots on May 2, 1992, around 30,000 people of all ethnicities marched through Koreatown. They marched for reconciliation between minority groups, specifically between Korean Americans and African Americans, and against the police, who had seemingly done nothing to stop the destruction of their stores and businesses. During the march, Pongmul, also called Nongak, a Korean folk dance, was performed. Pongmul is performed with drumming, singing, and dozens of dancers in constant motion. This folk dance was originally performed in rural farming communities in Korea and eventually became a symbol of Minjong, or the Korean people who had been oppressed by the ruling class. The performance, along with traditional chants and headbands associated with the Korean peasant class, were used to show support to Korean business owners and to reinstate the Korean identity that had been stripped from Koreatown from the riots. Korean Americans, residents of Koreatown, and nearby neighbors helped rebuild Koreatown. And in May of 1993, a year after the LA riots, about half of the damage in Koreatown had been repaired. Now, 27 years after the riot, Koreatown is a thriving hub of culture and commerce.
Just like as if you were in Korea. All the signs, restaurants on the streets are all written in Korean. You see most people are Koreans there. And it's like crowded. People, a lot of walking in the Koreatown. They walk a lot, and a lot of people there. It's just crowded area.
And the relationship between African American and Korean American communities have greatly improved. Korea's, Koreans, and Korean Americans' histories, folklore, and traditional dances shine brightly of their resilience. Koreans have faced difficulty after difficulty: oppressive government, Japanese colonization, discrimination, the dividing of their homeland time and time again. But they keep coming back from the ashes of their past like a phoenix, marching on to a constantly improving horizon. Hey, before I end the video, I just wanted to give a shout out to the women I interviewed. Amanda Vega is a small business owner of a sustainable online women boutique based in Falls Church, Virginia. And Mary Askin is a financial educator who teaches people how to better plan for their future. If you want to support what they do, I'll have links to their businesses as well as my full bibliography below. Thanks so much for watching.